At dawn on the 19th of November 1942, a dreary autumn morning, the lazy shadows and mists enveloping the barren steppes of the Don River, 160 kilometers northwest of Stalingrad, was suddenly ripped apart by dazzling light and growling thunder. Streaking through the white fog and lashing the dark skies, projectiles from thousands of guns mixed together for a roaring apocalyptic recital. It was 0730 hours Moscow time, and day one for a series of successful offensives that would lead the Red Army to reconquer the southern part of Russia, driving the Wehrmacht back to their initial positions for Operation Blau 6 months earlier. Operation Uran began it all. Its unbelievable success allowed the tide to turn. Yes, unbelievable is the right word, because as we'll explain, the operation had but a very slim chance of success. All this will go down in military history as a brilliant example of the enemy's operational art. Such were the words of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, talking to his former staff members shortly after the end of the battle. No one could better summarize the events that took place around Stalingrad beginning in late November 1942. But what Paulus doesn't say is that, as brilliant as it was, Operation Uran had very little chance of success. The question people usually ask is, how come the Germans didn't know about the Soviet preparations? But that's not the right question. In fact, the German command knew about the upcoming offensive. As we saw in the last episode, 6th Army's command was aware of the Soviet preparations, just as Army Group B and OKH were. But Hitler and Zeitzler didn't believe this could really develop into anything threatening. A first reason for this is that not all Soviet preparations could be detected in time. Another is that the Germans were used to poorly organized Soviet attacks on the Don front north of Stalingrad. And indeed, all these offensives had failed, one after another, for 3 months from August to October 1942. So the right question is not, why didn't they see it coming? Rather, one should ask, what were its chances of success? And to that question, the German command had but one answer: none. Why would the Germans think that another Soviet offensive would end any other way than all the others? Surely this one would be warded off just as easily as all the others had been. The Soviet offensives in the Kotlebane sector north of Stalingrad were rightly seen by the German command as diversionary operations, the aim of which was mainly to pin down German troops on the Don River while the battle raged on the Volga. But what the Germans failed to see is that these attacks also played a deceitful role in comforting them about the incapacity of the Red Army to lead large-scale, well-organized, successful operations. That is the thesis we'll develop here, and we're excited to do so, because clearly this aspect hasn't been discussed enough by historians. It's a tremendously important track to follow if we are to understand the conditions of Operation Uran. The Soviet counteroffensive was conceived while Stalingrad was on the verge of falling to the Germans. Basically, the city could be lost at any time from August to November. So firstly, the Soviet plans supposed the city could be defended during the whole of the 2 months necessary for Uran's preparation. The odds for this first prerequisite were tenuous at best, as it proved and as we know. But what people usually don't know is that many other prerequisites were also hard to achieve, not even speaking of the realization of the operation itself once it was launched. But, for the first time in the war, the Soviet command takes the time for careful planning, covering up and accumulating resources to match their expectations. Another surprising element: for the first time Stalin leaves a major operation in the hands of military professionals in the Army General Staff. We'll detail the principles of the operation and the realities on the terrain that could hinder its practical realization. But first of all, let's have a brief look at its genesis and try to answer the question, who was its mastermind? Operation Uran verifies the old adage, defeat is an orphan, but victory has many fathers. The best-known fatherhood story is the one Zhukov wrote in his memoirs. On the 12th of September, the same day Paulus met Hitler to discuss the capture of Stalingrad, Zhukov allegedly flew to Moscow, where Stalin had summoned him. There he met Vasilevsky, chief of the General Staff. After reviewing the situation between the Don and the Volga, the two men discussed the difficulties in breaking through Sixth Army's northern flank. But there's a problem with this account. Stalin's Book of Appointments, published in 1996, clearly shows that Zhukov did not set foot in the Kremlin between the 31st of August and the 26th of September. It is therefore probable that this account is either made up or that he aggregates episodes that occurred on different dates. Zhukov had all the more interest in passing for one of the parents of Operation Uran to try and veil the disastrous Operation Mars that he devised at the same time. Another argument against this story is that on the date Zhukov mentions, the 12th of September, the Romanian army had not yet replaced the German troops on the Don River. There was thus no reason to think an attack in this area would prove any better than on any other part of the front. The Third Romanian Army fully manned this defensive line only 1 month later, in October. However, there is no concrete argument either to completely rule out Zhukov's claim. The operation is similar to the two other battles that made him famous: Khalkhin-Gol in Mongolia in 1939 and Moscow in December 1941. Most probably, Zhukov devised the operation alongside Vasilevsky, chief of the General Staff, and provided the wrong dates for some reason. In his memoirs, Eremenko also applied for the fatherhood of Uran. He recounts that on the 2nd of August, as he received his appointment of commander of the Southeastern Front, he was emboldened to propose to Stalin an offensive to trap the Sixth Army in Stalingrad with a double envelopment. But in fact his plan was not of the same scale as the one that occurred. It relied mostly on cavalry and was to take place much closer to the city than Operation Uran was to do. So, who designed the legendary operation? It was probably a collective idea of the Stavka and the General Staff. In the end, it doesn't really matter who was the first to think of it, but the concept is a rather obvious one. However, it's one thing to lay down a concept, but it's quite another to fine-tune it, to assemble and send the necessary means, undercover in a difficult environment, and to finally make it happen. The whole concept of Uran rests on several assumptions that are so risky its success might depend as much on good fortune as on all the other factors. We can easily find 10 absolute conditions without which the operation could not succeed. 1. Assemble as quickly as possible immense quantities of men and material. 2. Transport these in regions with little or no rail capability. 3. Ensure that the enemy ignores, or at least misses, gigantic troop movements. 4. Assume that Stalingrad will withstand all the assaults for the 2 or 3 months necessary for the preparations. 5. Imagine that Hitler, despite the obvious risks, the approach of winter, and following the setbacks in Africa, will persist in the Stalingrad inferno until the end. A withdrawal of Sixth Army beyond the Don with a redistribution of forces to the flanks would have brought disaster upon the Soviet operation. 6. Hope that Sixth Army's flanks remain in a weakened state until Soviet troops are fully ready. 7. Believe in successfully coordinating 3 fronts and 11 armies. 8. Dare to think that the Red Army has the capacity to achieve what no other troops have ever done, encircle an entire German army in the open. 9. Keep this encirclement locked up against internal and external attacks until its complete destruction. 10. Believe that the destruction of up to 2 of the best armies of the German Reich will be completed before the arrival of spring. Because of these many conditions, several of which depended on the Germans themselves, Stalin and Zhukov had more faith in the success of Operation Mars than they did in Operation Uran. Although the German command has long been aware of the probability for a Soviet counter-offensive on the Don River, neither its scale nor its real objective had been anticipated. Until now, the Red Army had been notoriously unable to carry out a major strategic operation which actually reached its objectives. Nevertheless, repeated concerns were raised by the headquarters of the 6th Army and 3rd Romanian Army about the possibility of a breakthrough and even encirclement. However, the German intelligence services version still prevailed, which assured of a major offensive against Army Group Centre, whereas nothing but local penetrations were to be feared regarding Army Group B. Consequently, despite warnings issued at different levels, only minimal measures were undertaken, such as the gathering of various security detachments in the rear and the consolidation of men and material for the most threatened areas. Only in November, when most of the Soviet formations were finally detected, the OKH eventually decided to transfer divisions from France as reinforcements in this region. But they could not arrive on time anymore. Now that we're familiar with the strategic plans and the odds of the operation's success, and just before developing the actual day-to-day events to begin in the next episode, let's focus on the detail. On the eve of the war, the overall economic power of Germany and the USSR were comparable regarding key basic indicators, with roughly equivalent output in terms of energy and metallurgy, even though the German system was much more advanced in developing high-tech programs. The seizure of the Western USSR by the Wehrmacht dramatically modified the balance. After the conquest of most of the densely populated regions of Belarus, Ukraine and Russia in 1941, then the Donbass and Kuban in 1942, major components forming the base of the Soviet economy were gone. Grain production fell to 30%, while coal, steel and electricity outputs were reduced by half. Yearly truck production was reduced from 150,000 to 35,000. Allocations for the rail system were reduced to almost nothing. However, despite these terrible reductions, the Soviet Union's military output was able to rise to unimaginable levels due to a complete dedication and effort with the remaining resources, but to the detriment of the civilian production sector. Deprived of tractors and horses, agriculture became fully dependent on women and teenagers, working in conditions similar to that of feudal Russia centuries before. Millions of civilians were without shelter. New clothes were almost impossible to find. The population lacked every kind of basic commodities. They suffered from the cold and were on the verge of starvation. Millions mobilized to run the factories were exhausted beyond belief, working in conditions no better than frontline soldiers, 15 hours a day and 7 days a week, in plants often unheated and unsheltered, where absence or delay were equal to desertion. 20 years before the war, heavy industry development was already given top priority and carried on in tough, if not appalling conditions, providing the USSR with a mighty industrial base. When the war began, a large number of key factories and equipment were successfully transferred to the Urals, well beyond enemy range, where they were reconstructed and running again within an incredibly short time. As a result, and owing to the immense sacrifice of the population, the Soviet military complex was not only able to cope with the internal demand, but also largely outperformed Germany's. Lend-lease shipments of raw materials, specific end products, and logistical support vehicles allowed the Soviet industry to concentrate almost exclusively on a few key sectors. A small number of giant factory complexes began to produce armaments in vast quantities, and these were delivered in time for Operation Uran. Now let's consider the overall forces allocated to the fronts, from the northwest to the southeast. They were as follows. Vatutin's southwest front, comprising 1st Guards, 5th Tank and 21st Armies, numbering 390,000 men, 720 tanks, 8,600 guns, and was assisted by the 2nd and 17th Air Armies with 350 aircraft. Two-thirds of its armoured force was allocated to mobile formations for in-depth exploitation, namely the 1st, 4th and 26th Tank Corps. The 1st Guards Mechanised Corps was held in reserve for the second phase of the operations. That left about 200 vehicles for infantry support missions. The different formations were all well equipped and completed to almost 100% of their authorised strength, although their supplies were still a matter of concern and they were largely relying on the planned capture. Facing these forces were the 8th Italian Army's 35th Corps, the 3rd Romanian Army's 1st, 2nd, 4th and 5th Corps, with the 48th Panzer Corps held in reserve, totalling about 200,000 men and 140 tanks. In addition to having to defend an extended perimeter with few natural obstacles, only a portion of which was running along the Don River, the Romanian troops were rather depleted after their campaign in the Caucasus, and also severely short of anti-tank weapons, ammunition and mines, having to resort to using mostly outdated equipment. Similarly, the components of the sole mobile reserve in this region were not suited to contain a major Soviet attack. The 1st Romanian Armoured Division consisted mainly of obsolete R2 and Panzer 38 machines, almost useless against Soviet T-34s, whereas the actually operable tank park of the 22nd Panzer Division had dwindled dramatically because during the vehicle's immobilization through summer, their electrical cables had been gnawed through by mice lurking within the straw camouflage which covered them. Rokossovsky's Don Front, comprising the 65th, 24th and 66th Armies, numbered 285,000 men, 250 tanks, 6,600 guns, and was assisted by the 16th Air Army with 380 aircraft. Unlike the two other Soviet fronts, it did not include plenty of mobile forces, and the main purpose of its armour was to assist the infantry. It disposed only of the 16th Tank Corps to use for deeper exploitation in case of a breakthrough by standard troops. This force was facing a sector defended by the Wehrmacht's 6th Armies, 11th, 8th and 14th Corps, totalling 80,000 men, 110 tanks and adequate anti-tank devices. Here German forces were occupying long-established and strong positions, with natural and other specific obstacles running along the river line or advantageous heights. It had been the theatre for many unsuccessful Soviet attempts to break through during the late summer and early autumn, leaving the region littered with the wreckage of countless tanks. Nevertheless, here also shortages were perceptible, especially in men, as a result of divisions being withdrawn and sent into Stalingrad. Yermomenko's Stalingrad front, comprising the 62nd, 64th, 57th, 51st and 28th Armies, numbered 365,000 men, 570 tanks and 6,800 guns, and was assisted by the 8th Air Army with 780 aircraft. As in the southwestern front, two-thirds of its armoured force were allocated to mobile formations for in-depth exploitation, namely the 4th and 13th Mechanised Corps. It was facing the 6th Army's 51st Corps, 4th Panzer Army's 4th Corps and the 4th Romanian Army's 6th and 7th Corps, totalling 220,000 men and 250 tanks. The Axis forces were supported by the 8th Flieger Corps of the 4th Luftflotte with 730 aircraft, assisted by an additional 140 planes from the Romanian 1st Corpul Ariane. As imposing as these figures may seem, they are also misleading. The three Soviet fronts were actually short of resources, considering the gigantic demands of the tasks they faced. As a result, their formations were all deployed in a single echelon, and due to a relative scarcity in guns, the length of the artillery preparation was increased, to the detriment of the surprise effect. Also, the extreme flanks of the opposing factions could be considered as less relevant because they were to play a secondary role during the current offensive, thus reducing the balance of forces in the southwestern and Stalingrad fronts' operational areas. In the northern sector, a large part of the Soviet 1st Guards Army facing the Italian 8th Army was actually to not act as part of Uran, but as part of Saturn, the next planned operation, For this reason, the Italian formations do not appear in the subsequent order of battle. On the other side of the theatre, in the distant southern Kalmyk steppe, the Soviet 28th Army was opposed to the German 16th Motorized Division on a vast front running through a desolate landscape with the town of Elista as a unique oasis and principal objective. Consolidated figures for both sides result in a grand total of about 1 million men, 20,000 artillery pieces, 1,500 tanks and 1,500 aircraft for the Soviet forces, opposed to 500,000 men, 5,000 artillery pieces, 500 tanks and 900 aircraft for the Axis forces. The balance ratios are therefore simple to evaluate: 2-to-1 for personnel, 4-to-1 for artillery, 3-to-1 for tanks, 2-to-1 for aircraft, all in favour of the Soviets. As we'll detail in the upcoming episodes of this series, Operation Uran was a main turning point not only in the Soviet-German War, but in World War II as a whole. Its consequences were absolutely tremendous and extended well beyond the area where it took place. It dramatically changed the course of the war in Europe and represented the first clear evidence that Nazi Germany would eventually lose. It was really groundbreaking.
Operation Uranus is fully understood when a person researches the battle from every perspective. Only with a 360-degree observation will a person really learn the origins and outcomes of great historical events. Diligent historical research benefits both you and I with critical thinking and discernment skills. Both are required for future success.